الحمد لله رب العالمين وأصلي وأسلم على مبعوث رحمة للعالمين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So we continue بإذن الله تعالى with our reading through the explanation of the conditions of the prayer, its pillars and its obligations. And we discussed last time the fourth condition in relation to the removal of the ritual impurity. And then we mentioned the conditions of the wudhu. So we discussed the wudhu and we mentioned some of its or all of its conditions. And now we will move on bi'idhnillahi ta'ala with the furud, with the obligations of the wudu. So Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala, that he says, وَأَمَّا فُرُوضُهُ فَسِتَّةٌ. So as for his obligations, then they are 6. غَسْلُ الْوَجْهِ وَمِنْهُ الْمَضْمَضَةِ وَالْإِسْتِنْشَاقِ وَحَدُّهُ طُولًا من منابت شعر الرأس إلى الذقن وعرضا إلى فروع الأذنين. So the obligations of the wudu are 6. Washing the face. First one is washing the face. And included in this, or from this, is the rinsing of the mouth, and likewise the insertion of water into the nose, and washing the nose. And its boundaries, the boundaries of the face, lengthwise is from the hairline, where the hairline begins, up until the chin. And widthwise is from the right ear to the left ear, from each of the 2 ears. وَغَسْلُ الْيَدَيْنِ إِلَى الْمِرْفَقَيْنِ. And washing the hands up until the elbows. وَمَسْحُ جَمِيعِ الرَّأْسِ وَمِنْهُ الْأُذُنَانِ. And wiping over the entire head, and from it, or included in it, are the 2 ears. وَغَسْلُ الرِّجْلَيْنِ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. And washing the feet up until the ankle. وَالتَّرْتِيبِ. And doing so in order. وَالْمُوَالَاتِ. And likewise doing so in succession, so that not one limb becomes dry from another limb. وَالدَّلِيلُ قَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى. And the evidence for this is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. Is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal in Surah Al-Ma'idah, O you who believe, if you establish the prayer, then wash your faces and your arms up until your elbows, and wipe over your heads, and wash your feet to the ankles. وَدَلِيلُ التَّرْتِيبِ. And the evidence for the tartib, the order. حديث ابدأوا بما بدأ الله به. The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, wherein he said, begin with that which Allah began. Begin with that which Allah had begun. وَالدَّلِيلُ مُوَالَاتِ. And the evidence for it being in succession. حديث صاحب اللمعة. The hadith of the man who left a spot unwashed. And that is the hadith عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه لما رأى رجلا في قدمه لمعة قدر الدرهم لم يصبها الماء فأمره بالإعادة. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, that when he saw a man and there was the size of a dirham that was left unwashed on his foot, that had not come into contact with water. So he ﷺ commanded him to repeat his wudhu. طيب. So he began rahimahullah ta'ala, or he begins with these obligations, with the furud of the wudhu, with the obligations of the wudhu. And firstly, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, that we will look at the definition of the word fardh. There was the ta'rif and the definition of the word fardh. هو ما يثاب عليه فاعله ويعاقب عليه تاركه. Is that which the one who does the action is rewarded for, and the one who leaves off the action, then he is punished for doing so. Again, the one who does the action, then he is rewarded for doing the action. And the one who leaves it off, then he is punished for leaving off the action. And we find, أيها الإخوة, that the definition for fard is the same definition for al-wajib, for the word wajib. So what's the difference between the two? Is there any difference between the two? Between if we were to say that this affair is wajib, or if we were to say that this affair is fard. Is there a difference between the two? And we find that Jamhur Ahl al-Ilm, that the majority of the people of knowledge, that they are upon the opinion of عدم التفريق بين الفرض والواجب, that there is no difference between fard, if something is fard, and if something is wajib. That the two are interchangeable, the two words are interchangeable. بخلاف الأحناف, in opposition to the Ahnaf, to the Hanafis, that they hold there to be a difference between the two. The Hanafis, the Ahnaf, that they hold there to be a difference between the two. And they argue and they say that because there is a slight variation in terms of its linguistic meaning, then therefore there has to be a difference in relation to its shar'i meaning, in relation to the Islamic legislative meaning. And this is why you find that they say, for example, that the salawatul khams, the 5 daily prayers, that they are fard. And then they say, but salatul witr is wajib. Or some of them say that the salatul witr is wajib. So they hold the word wajib to be a lesser obligation than that which is fard. So they say that the 5 daily prayers are fard and that witr is wajib. And they hold the word wajib to be a lesser obligation than the word fard. But as we mentioned, the majority of scholars, that they mentioned that there is no difference between the two, and that both are used interchangeably. They can be used in replace of one another. So the first condition that he mentions, or we read now bi'idhnillahi ta'ala through the explanation of the Allama Shaykh Abdul Muhsin Al-Abbad Hafidahullah ta'ala. So he says, Hafidahullah, صفة الوضوء جاءت مبينة في كتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم. That the sifa, the description of the wudu, that it has come clearly in the book of Allah Azza wa Jal and in the sunnah of His Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم. ففي كتاب الله عز وجل جاءت في سورة المائدة في قوله تعالى. As for in the book of Allah Azza wa Jal, then it has been mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah in the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين. O you who believe, that if you establish the prayer, then wash your faces and your arms up until your elbows, and wipe over your heads and wash your feet to the ankles. Then he explains, حفظه الله, ومعنى قوله إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة أي أردتم القيام لها وأنتم على غير طهارة. And the meaning here of the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة, or you who believe, that if you establish the prayer, meaning here that if you intend to establish the prayer, if you intend to establish the prayer and you are not in a state of purification. And then he says, مثل قوله تعالى, this is similar to the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. That if you read the Quran, then seek refuge with Allah from the accursed shaitan. Meaning إِذَا أَرَدْتَ الْقِرَاءَةِ, meaning if you intend to read the Quran, before you read the Quran, if you intend to read it, then seek refuge with Allah Azza wa Jal from the shaitan. وأما سنة الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم فقد جاءت من قوله وفعله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And as for the sunnah of the Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم, then it has come by way of his statement and his action. Both his statement and his action صلى الله عليه وسلم. ومن ذلك, and from that, عن حمران مولى عثمان بن عفان رضي الله تعالى عنهما, from the narration of Humran, who أنه رأى عثمان دعا بوضوء, that he saw Uthman, that he called for wudu, for water to make wudu with, that he called for it to be brought to him. فأفرغ على يديه من إنائه, so he poured it upon his hands from the vessel. فغسلهما ثلاث مرات, and he washed his hands 3 times. ثم أدخل يمينه في الوضوء, and then he placed his hand, or he entered his hand into the wudu, into the water. بالفتح, here الوضوء بالفتحة, is wudu with a fatha and not a dhamma. And the difference between them, the al-wudu is the water that is used in order to make wudu, and wudu is the action of making wudu, of washing one's limbs in order to perform the wudu. طيب, ثم تمضمض واستنشق واستنثر, then he inserted water into his mouth and into his nose, and he withdrew it. ثم غسل وجهه ثلاثا, then he washed his face 3 times. ويديه إلى المرفقين ثلاثا, and his 2 arms up into his elbows 3 times. ثم مسح برأسه, and then he wiped over his head. ثم غسل كل رجل ثلاثا, then he washed each leg 3 times. ثم قال, and then he said رضي الله تعالى عنه, رأيت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يتوضأ نحو وضوء هذا, that I saw the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم performing wudu just as I have performed wudu. وقال, and he said صلى الله عليه وسلم, من توضأ نحو وضوء هذا ثم صلى ركعتين لا يحدث فيهما نفسه غفر الله له ما تقدم من ذنبه. That whoever performs wudu, such as this wudu, the wudu that I have performed, then he prays 2 rak'ahs and he does not speak to himself therein, then Allah Azza wa Jal will forgive him of his previous sins, his previous minor sins. Rawah al-Bukhari wa Muslim, is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. طيب, وغسل الأعضاء ثلاثا هو الوضوء الكامل. And washing the limbs 3 times, that is that which is known as the complete wudu. The wudu that is kamil, the wudu that is complete. وَلَا يَجُوزُ الزِّيَادَةَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ. And it is not permissible to increase upon that. Meaning it is not permissible to wash your limbs more than 3 times. وَقَدْ جَاءَ الْوُضُوءُ مَرَّتَيْن وَمَرَّةً مَرَّةً. And the wudu has come, meaning the description of the wudu has come, washing the limbs twice or 2 times, and likewise once. وَالْوُضُوءُ الْوَاجِبُ مَرَّةً وَاحِدَةً. And the wudu that is wajib, is an obligation, then that is 1 time. Washing your limbs 1 single time. مستوعبة جميع أعضاء الوضوء. Incorporating all of the limbs of the wudu. وفروض الوضوء 6. And the obligations of the wudu are 6. And now he begins to explain each and every individual obligation, حفظه الله تعالى. So he says, الأول, the first one, غسل الوجه, to wash the face. وحده طولا من منابت شعر الرأس إلى ما استرسل من اللحية. And its boundaries, the boundaries of the face, lengthwise, that it's from the hairline, the beginning of the hairline, to all the way down to the beard, and that which flows from the beard. وعرضا, and widthwise, ما دون الأذنين, that which is in between the 2 ears. And likewise included in that which is between the 2 ears is the gap that is in between the lihya, that is in between the beard and the ear itself. That you find that there is a slight gap between the beard and the ear itself. That is also included in washing the face. والأذنان في الوضوء من الرأس فتمسحان وليستا من الوجه فتغسلان. And the 2 ears in relation to wudu, that they are considered as part of the ra's, as part of the head, so they are wiped over, as we will come to bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. That they are considered as part of the head, so they are wiped over, and they are not considered as part of the face, so they are not washed. They are not considered as part of the face. That the ears are not included or considered as being part of the face, so they are not washed with the face, but rather they are wiped over along with the head, as we will come to bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Then he says, حفظه الله تعالى, وتخليل اللحية مستحب. And making takhleel of the lihya, running one's fingers in between his beard, and washing in between the hairs of his beard, that it is mustahab, it is recommended. It is recommended. والواجب في غسل الوجه غسل ما به المواجهة فلا يدخل في ذلك تخليل اللحية. And what is an obligation in relation to washing the face is that whatever is apparent be washed. So that is not included, or not included in that is washing the inner part of the beard, or running one's fingers through his beard in order to wash the inner part of his beard. And in relation to this mas'ala, in relation to this issue, أيها الإخوة, they will briefly mention بإذن الله تعالى some of the opinions of Ahl al-Ilm in relation to this. So firstly, the Jamhur, the majority of the scholars, that they distinguish between the 2 types of lihya. That the majority of scholars, that they differentiate and distinguish between the 2 types of lihya. So they say that there is the lihya that is kathitha, the lihya that is thick, there's a thick beard, and the lihya that is khafifah, the beard that is light and thin. And the meaning of light and thin here, meaning that the skin underneath the beard can be seen. طيب. So then they say, so as for the beard that is khafifah, the beard that is light and thin, then they hold it to be wajib. طيب, they hold it to be an obligation that the inside of it be washed. Again, they say that the beard that is thin and light, that it is an obligation to wash the inner part of it. That water reaches the skin. And they say that if it is thick, it is a thick beard where the skin cannot be seen, then it is not wajib to ensure that water reaches the skin underneath the beard. But rather they say it is mustahab. It is mustahab, it is recommended to make takhleel. It is recommended for a person to run his fingers through his beard with water. طيب. And some of Ahl al-Ilm, such as Abu Thawr and Ustādh, that they did not make this distinction between the lihya that is thick and between the lihya that is khafifah, that is thin. So they said that both must be washed. That both, the inner part, the skin that is underneath, that it must be washed. They must allow water to reach the skin. And they use as a proof the hadith of Anas radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, as collected by Abi Dawood, or in the Sunan of Abi Dawood, وصححه الألباني رحمه الله تعالى. And that is that the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم كان إذا توضأ أخذ كفا من ماء فأدخله تحت حنكه فخلل به لحيته وقال هكذا أمرني ربي عز وجل. And that is that he said رضي الله تعالى عنه, that the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم, that when he would make wudu, that he would take his hand, and his hand filled with water, and he would place it on his throat. And he would begin to run his fingers through his beard. And then he said that this is how my Lord has commanded me. Or this is what my Lord has commanded me with. So they use this hadith to say that it is an obligation. And the general principle, أيها الإخوة, as we know that the amr, the command, يدل على إيش؟ يدل على الوجوب. That the command, that from that which it indicates, or the asl, the original ruling of the command, is that indicates that it is an obligation. That this affair is wajib, that this affair is an obligation. Except إذا كان هناك صارفا. Except if there is something else, another evidence to divert it away from that original ruling, to take it away, or to prove that that command is not a command that is for wujub, that is an obligation. So if there is something to take it away from that original ruling and prove that this command is not a command, it is an obligation, then it becomes a command that is lil istihbab. There's a recommendation. طيب. So, based upon that, how did the Jamhur respond? How did the majority of the scholars here, in this instance, how do they respond to this second opinion? Yani, is there a sarif here? Is there anything to divert it, to take it away from its original ruling that it is an obligation? So they say, they respond, and they say, and this is a very important argument that they make, that they say that the beard of the Prophet ﷺ, the lihya of the Prophet ﷺ, that was it a lihya that was kathitha, or was it a lihya that was khafitha? Was the beard of the Prophet ﷺ, was it thick, or was it a beard that was thin? And no doubt his beard ﷺ was a beard that was thick. And pay attention to the argument. Did they say that his beard ﷺ was a thick beard? Then they say, yet it was not reported that he ﷺ would make takhleel of his lihya in all of the narrations. Again, they say that it was not reported that he ﷺ, that he would make takhleel of his lihya, of his beard, in all of the narrations. Some of the narrations mention that he ﷺ would make takhleel, but it is not mentioned in all of the narrations. So what is the shahid here? What is the point here? What does this prove? I want the brothers to think about this bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And how does this response, or how is this a response to the previous argument? What is the point that they're trying to make here? And that is because if it was wajib, if it was an obligation to make takhleel of the lihya, then would he ﷺ have not done it? Hasha lillahi wa kalla. He ﷺ would have no doubt have been narrated to have done it in all of the narrations. It would have been narrated from him in every single narration that details and describes the description of how he ﷺ made wudhu. If it had been the case, there was an obligation that the companions who narrated the ahadith concerning the wudu of the Prophet ﷺ, that they would not have missed that detail, that they would have observed the Prophet ﷺ doing it every time that he made wudu, and they would have surely narrated it, all of them. And it would not be the case that is only mentioned, or is mentioned in some of the narrations, but not every single one of them. Because no doubt, ayyuhal ikhwah, that the companions, that they had observed the Prophet ﷺ, and they were there witnessing him, and they were then narrating with dhabt, with accuracy. They were daqiq al-wasf. They were very detailed in their description. So that detail would not have escaped them. Barakallahu feekum. طيب. Then, back to the explanation of Shaykh Abdul Muhsin, Hafidahullah Ta'ala. There he says, ويدخل في غسل الوجه المضمضة والاستنشاق. And included in the washing of the face is the madmadah and the istinshaq. يعني the rinsing of the mouth and of the nose. كما جاء ذلك مبينا في حديث عثمان رضي الله عنه وغيره. Just as has come in the narration of Uthman رضي الله عنه and other than him. طيب, and in relation to the istinshaq, يعني the insertion of water into the nose, the washing of the nose, then it is recommended يستحب فيه المبالغة. It is recommended that a person does so with excessiveness, with emphasis. Except for in one case. And that is when the person is fasting. When a person is fasting. As been mentioned in the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, وَبَالِغْ فِي الْإِسْتِنْشَاقِ إِلَّا أَن تَكُنْ صَائِمًا. And exaggerate in the washing of the nose, except if you are fasting. And likewise the madmadah and the istinshaq that is done with one single hand. And that a person takes a handful of water and that he enters a part of that water into his mouth to rinse his mouth, and a part of it into his nose to rinse his nose. Then he says, Habibullah Ta'ala, الثاني, the second obligation. غسل اليدين إلى المرفقين. Washing the hands up until the elbows. وذلك من أطراف الأصابع إلى نهاية المرفقين. And that is from the fingertips all the way up to the end of the elbows. So from the fingertips all the way up until the end of the elbows. داخلان في الغسل. والمرفقان داخلان في الغسل. And the two elbows, that they are included in washing the arms. ولا يكفي في غسل الكفين في الوضوء غسلهما قبل بدء الوضوء. And it's not sufficient in relation to washing. It's not sufficient in relation to washing the arms that a person had washed his hands prior to the wudu. لأن ذلك مستحب إلا عند القيام من النوم. Because that is something that is recommended to do. That a person is recommended that before he starts his wudu, that he washes his hands. Before he has started his wudu, that he washes his hands. But that does not suffice him now from washing his hands when he comes to washing his entire arm. That he still washes his hands starting from the fingertip up until the end of the elbow. So it's recommended for him to wash his hands prior to the wudu, except in the instance of him when he wakes up from his sleep, or when he rises from his sleep. فَإِنَّهُ وَاجِبٌ. For it is an obligation then. It is an obligation. لأمر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Due to the command of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. وعلله بقوله, and he mentioned the reason due to it. He said فإنه لا يدري أين باتت يده. Because he does not know where his hands have been whilst he is in a state of sleep. So therefore some of the ulama, that they hold it to be wajib. They hold this command from the Prophet ﷺ to be an obligation. There's an obligation for a person to wash his hands after he has risen from sleep, from his sleep. طيب. Then he said, حفظه الله, وغسل اليدين يكون بعد غسل الوجه فلا يكفي ما كان قبله. And washing of the hands, that it is done after the washing of the face, so is not sufficient, it does not suffice with that which he done before, so with the washing of the hands that he done prior to it. طيب. الثالث, the third obligation, مسح الرأس, wiping over the head. And that is due to his statement, subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ, they wipe over your heads. Wipe over your heads. And this ba here that is mentioned in the ayah, that it is a ba that is لِلْمُلَاسَقَةِ وَلَيْسَ لِلتَّبْعِيضِ. Some of the people have falsely interpreted or misunderstood that this ba in the ayah, that it is for contact. So we translate it as wipe over the heads. طيب. And it is not the ba that is used للتبعيض, that is used for a portion or to allot a portion of something. Some of it. It does not mean to wipe over some of the head or a portion of the head, but rather wipe over the entire head. Wipe over the head. طيب. ويكون مرة واحدة, and it is done one single time. يبدأ فيها من مقدم رأسه إلى مؤخره ثم يعود إلى المكان الذي بدأ منه. So it is done one time, and he begins with the front of his head, where his hairline starts, the front of his head, above his forehead, and then he goes all the way back down, back around his head, all the way down to the end of his hairline. And then he returns back to the place that he began from. He returns back to the start of his hair. And Ahl al-Ilm, that they have mentioned 3 ways of making masih ala al-ra's. They have mentioned 3 ways of wiping over the head that can be done through these 3 ways. The first of which is that which we just mentioned, that a person begins from the start of his hair, start of his hairline, which is above his forehead, and he wipes all the way down to the back of his head. And then he returns back to where he started from. طيب. That's the first way. The second way is the opposite to this. That he begins from the back of his head and he wipes all the way to the front of his head where his hairline starts, and then he returns to the back of his head. And these two ways وردت في الصحيح, that they have been mentioned in the authentic narrations. طيب. And there is another way that has been mentioned, and it is in the hadith of Rubay'ah radiallahu anha, that is collected by Abu Dawood and other than him. وحسنه الألباني رحمه الله, and Albani declared it to be good, to be a good chain of narration. And that is that he wipes over his hairline starting from the forehead to the back of his hair, to the back of his head. So he wipes over his hairline starting from where the hair begins above the forehead all the way to the back of his head where his hair ends. طيب. Then what he does is he stops. He doesn't go back over it in the opposite direction, but rather he stops and then he returns back to the front of his hairline, without wiping over his head again, but he starts from the beginning and he repeats this. طيب, is that clear? That he starts from his hairline above his forehead, the beginning of his hair, and he wipes all the way down to the back of his head, and then he stops, and then he goes, or he doesn't wipe back over, but rather he takes his hands and he takes them back to the starting place, to above his forehead, and then he wipes over his head again in the same direction. That these are the three ways that have been mentioned for wiping over the head. طيب. Then he says, حفظه الله تعالى, وما استرسل من شعر المرأة فإنه لا يمسح. And that which flows from the hair of the woman, then it is not wiped over, meaning she does not wipe over the entire length of her hair. بل يكتفي أو يكتفى بالمسح إلى مؤخر الرأس ويمسح مع الرأس الأذنان. But rather it is sufficient to wipe up until the end of the head, and to also wipe with the head the two ears. That likewise he wipes with his head his two ears. And what is most correct is that he uses the same water. So he uses the same water that is used to wipe his hair, or to wipe his head, that he uses that same water to then wipe over his ears. He doesn't then go and take new water to then start his ears, but rather what is most correct is that he uses the same water, the remaining water that he has used to wipe over his head. And he places his two index fingers inside his ear and his thumbs on the outside of his ear, and he wipes over the entire ear. طيب. الرابع, the fourth obligation, غسل الرجلين إلى الكعبين, and that is the washing of the feet up until the كعبين, up until the ankles. والكعبان داخلا في الغسل, and the two ankles that they are included in the washing. وفي كل رجل كعبان, and every leg or every foot that it has two ankles, two sides to the ankle. وليس المراد بالكعبين العظمين الناتئين في ظهر القدم كما يزعمه بعض فرق الضلال فيمسحون إليهما. And the intended meaning here is not the two ankle bones that are apparent on the foot, as some of the deviated groups that they suggest, and they wipe over them. ولعل الشيخ, and perhaps the Shaykh here حفظه الله تعالى, that he is referring to the Rafidah and their like, those who are known for wiping over their feet, or wiping over their ankles. فإن فرض الرجلين الغسل وليس المسح. For the obligation of washing, or the obligation in relation to the feet, is that they are washed and not that they are wiped. وقد دلت قراءة وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين بفتح اللام. And what is an evidence for this is the qira'ah, is the recitation of the ayah that we mentioned, and the ayah in relation to the wudu, the description of the wudu, that the ayah is mentioned وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ بِالْفَتْحَةِ, على اللام إلى الكعبين. وسنة الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم التي بينت صفة الوضوء على ذلك. And likewise, as an evidence, is the sunnah of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم that has clarified the description of the wudu as being one that he used to wash his feet to the ankles صلى الله عليه وسلم. وأما قراءة الكسرة في وأرجلكم فهي محمولة على الغسل الخفيف جمعا بين قراءتين. Then it is carried to be, or is meant to be, a light washing, and this is جمعا بين قراءتين, in order to harmonize between the two different types of recitation. So just to explain this briefly, بإذن الله تعالى, that the difference between the two. So we have the first recitation that we mentioned, and that is وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْن with a fatha, وَأَرْجُلَ بالفتحة وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْن. So in this recitation, in this qira'ah, the waw is ma'tuf ala ru'us. عفوا, the waw is ma'tuf ala al-wujuh. The waw is ma'tuf على الوجوه وأيدي. That the waw here, that it is connected and joined to that which was mentioned prior to it, which is the washing of the face and the hands. So hence why it is fatha, because it's مفعولا به منصوب. The action has been done to it, so therefore it is in a state of nasb. That which is known in Arabic grammar, and those who understand the Arabic language understand the state of it being in a state of a nasb, that is mansoob. So the meaning here would be فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ, wash your faces and your hands and your arms, and included in that would be وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ, and likewise your feet. As for the recitation, there is a kasrah upon the arjul, وَأَرْجُلِكُمْ, then the waw here is ma'tuf ala ru'us, that is joined and is connected to the heads. Hence why it is majroor. Again, for those who understand the Arabic language, hence why it is in a state of being majroor, because ru'us is also majroor due to the ba. The ba, it is from the adawat al-jar, فيكون الجر والمجرور. So the meaning here upon this recitation with the kasrah, then the meaning here is that it will refer back to the wiping. So wipe over the head and the feet. In accordance to this recitation. And this shows us, أيها الإخوة, the importance of learning and understanding the Arabic language, and that how just a simple harakah from a fatha to a kasrah, that it changes the entire meaning, taking it from being either washed, that which is washed and included in that which is mentioned with being washed, or that which is wiped and included in that which is mentioned to be wiped. And we find Ahl al-Dalal, the people of misguidance, that they try to utilize these points here, or some of these linguistic points, in order to support and give aid to their false opinions. So they will use this qira'ah of the arjulikum, of the kasrah, and they will neglect and cast aside the qira'ah, the well-known qira'ah, the well-known recitation of وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ. Why? Because وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ with a fatha, that it refutes that which they are upon by way of wiping over their feet. Why? Because it is connected, as we said, to that which is included in being washed. So as the Shaykh Habibullah Ta'ala explained, that the recitation that has a kasrah, then the meaning here is not that it should be wiped, but rather it is carried to be, or to mean, that it is a light washing. Not that it should be wiped, but rather it is a light washing. And this is in order to harmonize between the two recitations. Then he says, Habibullah Ta'ala, this important point that he makes, وَالْاِعْتِمَادُ عَلَيْهَا وَتَرْكُ غَسْلِ الرِّجْلَيْنِ الذي دلت عليه قراءة النصب ودلت عليه السنة هو من اتباع المتشابه وترك المحكم. He said, Habibullah Ta'ala, and relying upon this recitation, the recitation with the kasrah, and abandoning and leaving off the washing of the feet, in which the qira'ah, the recitation with the fatha, in which it clearly and explicitly shows, and that which the sunnah clearly indicates, then this is no doubt from following the mutashabih, from following those doubtful affairs, and leaving off that which is muhkam, leaving off that which is clear. So it's from following those unclear and ambiguous affairs and leaving off that which is clear. ويكفي في معرفة ضلال من ضل عن الحق في مسألة غسل الرجلين والاكتفاء بمسح ظهورهما أنهم حرموا أنفسهم سيما التحجيل التي قال فيها النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. And then he said, Habibullah Ta'ala, that is sufficient. It is sufficient in recognizing the misguidance of those who have diverted away from the truth in relation to this affair of washing the feet, and that they suffice themselves with wiping over them. There is sufficient in this affair that they have deprived their own selves of this tahjeel that the Prophet ﷺ said in relation to, when he said ﷺ, إِنَّ أُمَّتِي يُدَعُونَ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ غَرًّا مُحَجَّلِينَ مِنْ آثَارِ الْوُضُوءِ, that my ummah, that they will be summoned on the day of resurrection, غَرًّا, and غَرًّا is علامة بيضاء تظهر على الجبين. There is a white mark that appears upon the forehead. There is a white mark that appears upon the forehead. So they will be identified and called out due to that white mark that appears upon the forehead, and likewise this tahjeel, muhajjalin. And this tahjeel is علامة بيضاء تظهر على الأقدام. It is a white sign that will appear upon their feet. That will appear upon their feet. So the ummah will be called out and summoned and identified on the day of resurrection due to this white mark that appears on their forehead and these white marks that appear upon their feet. Min athar al-wudu, from the traces of their wudu. So those who do not wash their feet, that they have deprived themselves from this tremendous virtue. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal that He makes us from them, the muhajjalin, min athari wudu'ihim yawm al-qiyamah. طيب. And the hadith أخرجه البخاري ومسلم عن أبي هريرة. طيب. Likewise, وأنهم عرضوا أنفسهم للوعيد الذي جاء في قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم ويل للأعقاب من النار. And likewise, they have exposed their own selves to the severe threat. So not only have they prevented themselves from receiving this huge virtue and this huge blessing, but they have also exposed themselves to this severe threat that has come in the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, وَيْلٌ لِلْأَعْقَابِ مِنَ النَّارِ, that woe to the ankles from the fire. أخرجه البخاري ومسلم. And the meaning here is that he ﷺ, that he said this due to that incident which we mentioned earlier regarding the Sahib al-Lum'ah, regarding the one who had the size of a dirham that was left, that wasn't touched by water, that he didn't wash his feet, that he did not wash his feet properly, so there was a size of a dirham that was left upon his foot whereby the water had not touched. So the Prophet ﷺ ordered him to repeat his wudu, and he ﷺ said this statement. So within it is a severe threat to those who do not wash their feet entirely. طيب. Al-Khamis, the fifth affair, الترتيب, the order that a person performs the wudu in accordance to the order and the correct sequence. فيجب غسل أعضاء الوضوء على الترتيب الذي جاء في الآية. So it's an obligation that a person washes his limbs, the limbs of wudu, in accordance to the tartib, in accordance to the sequence and the order that has been mentioned in the ayah. In relation to the wudu. وجاء في فعله صلى الله عليه وسلم في وضوئه فلا يجوز أن يقدم غسل اليدين على غسل الوجه. And likewise it has come through his actions صلى الله عليه وسلم in relation to his wudu. So it is not permissible, for example, that he washes his hands before he has washed his face. ولا مسح الرأس على غسل اليدين وهكذا, or that he wipes over his head before he has washed his arms, and so on and so forth. أما لو غسل اليد اليسرى قبل اليمنى أو الرجل اليسرى قبل اليمنى فإن الوضوء صحيح إجماعا. As for if he was to wash his left hand before his right hand, or he was to wash his left foot before his right foot, then his wudu is sahih. His wudu is fine, it's intact. And this is ijma'an, by the consensus of the scholars. And that is due to the fact, ayyuhal ikhwah, that at-tayamun fil wudu min sunnihi, that beginning with the right in wudu, that it is from the sunnah, the sunan. It's from the sunan, the sunnah acts of the wudu. It is recommended for him to do, and it is not an obligation. وهو خلاف الأولى, and is not the same, or is in opposition to the first that we mentioned. going against the tartib, going against the order, the correct order. طيب, then he says حفظ الله تعالى قال الحافظ ابن حجر في الفتح قال النووي قاعدة الشرع المستمرة استحباب البداءة باليمين في كل ما كان من باب التكريم والتزيين. The consistent general principle found in the Sharia, found in the legislation, is the recommendation to begin with the right in all of that which is considered as noble. وما كان بضدهما استحب فيه التياسر. And as for that which is in opposition to it, then it is recommended, or it is likened to use the left hand. And that which is not done out of nobility, then is recommended to use the left hand when doing so. قال وأجمع العلماء على أن تقديم اليمين في الوضوء سنة. And the scholars have unanimously agreed that placing the right before the left in the wudu is a sunnah, it is a recommended act. من خالفها فاته الفضل وتم وضوءه. Whoever leaves it, whoever opposes it, then he has missed out on the great virtue, but his wudu is complete. Then he says وَنُقِلَ عن ابن قدامة في المغني أنه قال, and has been narrated and transmitted from Ibn Qudamah in Al-Mughni that he said لا نعلم في عدم الوجوب خلافا. And we do not know any differing in relation to it not being an obligation. وقد استدل الشيخ رحمه الله للترتيب بحديث ابدأوا بما بدأ الله به. And the Shaykh rahimahullah ta'ala, that he used as a proof for the obligation of a tartib, the obligation of it being in order, the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ابدأوا بما بدأ الله به. Begin with that which Allah has begun with. قال صلى الله عليه وسلم ذلك عندما بدأ بالصفا في سعيه. The Prophet ﷺ said this statement when he began at Mount Safa, when he was performing the sa'i. طيب. والحديث بلفظ الأمر جاء في سنن النساء. And the hadith with the wording of a command that has been mentioned in the sunan of An-Nisa'i, with this command ابدأوا, begin, it's a command mentioned in Sunan النسائي. وهو في صحيح مسلم بلفظ الخبر. And in Sahih Muslim is mentioned with the wording of al-khabar, of informing, meaning that he sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said أبدأ بما بدأ الله به. I begin with that which Allah has begun. وهو من حديث جابر الطويل في صفة حجه. It is taken from the hadith of Jabir, the long hadith that depicts and details the description of his Hajj صلى الله عليه وسلم. وفيه فلما دنا من الصفا قرأ إن الصفا والمروة من شعائر الله أبدأ بما بدأ الله به. And that is when he came close to Safa, that he read the ayah إن الصفا والمروة من شعائر الله. Then he said that I begin with that which Allah began. فبدأ بالصفا فرقي عليه حتى رأى البيت. So he began at Mount Safa, and then he ascended upon it up until he could see the Bayt, up until he could see the Kaaba. طيب, وانظر إرواء الغليل. ومعنى قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم أبدأ بما بدأ الله به أن الله لما ذكر الصفا والمروة قدم الصفا على المروة، فما بدأ الله به ذكرا بدأ به رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بالسعي فعلا. And the meaning of his statement sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that I begin with that which Allah began with, is that Allah Azza wa Jal, that He mentioned Safa before He mentioned Marwa. The ayah that He mentioned Safa before He mentioned Marwa. So He sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that He began likewise in His action with beginning and starting His sa'i Safa before Marwa. طيب, and that which is an evidence also in relation to the condition of tartib, of following the sequence and the order, is his fi'l sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. طيب, so we have an evidence which is qawliya, which is a statement of his abda'u bima bada Allahu bi, or ibda'u bima bada Allahu bi, and we have a statement, or we have that which is fi'liya, that which is from his actions, and that is that he sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that he was never known to ever contradict and go against this specific tartib, this specific order of making the wudu. طيب, والسادس, inshallah ta'ala, we will finish up with this last point in relation to the sixth condition, and that the sixth obligation, afwan, and that is the muwalat, that is done in succession. هو أن يوالي بين الأعضاء في الغسل فلا يغسل بعضها ثم ينشغل عن الاستمرار في الوضوء. And that is that he continues to wash the limbs, and he does not wash some of them and then become occupied or become distracted from continuing with his wudu. إلا إذا كان الانشغال لعارض يسير كفتح باب قريب فإنه لا يؤثر. Except for if he was to become preoccupied with a small emergency, with a small or a light emergency. For example, if he had to open a door that was really, really close to him and near to him, then this does not affect his wudu. Meaning, if he discontinued his wudu momentarily in order to open a door, or due to a small emergency or the like of it, then this does not affect his wudu. طيب, and what is the dhabit in relation to this? What is the definitive factor? How do we know, or how much time has to have passed by or elapsed that we can then say that this person, that he has to now perform wudu again from the start? What is the defining factor in relation to that? What is the limit whereby we now say to a person that you have not completed your wudu, that you cut off midway, and you was away, or you took too much time away, so you cannot return back and just continue with your wudu, but rather you have to start from fresh, from new. So Ahlul Ilm have said that as long as the person لا يفصل بينها بفاصل طويل عرفا, that a person does not separate between them with a huge elapse in time, عرفا, and that returns back to the customs of the people, goes back to the urf, and that which the people consider to be a specific period of time, or a long period of time. And some of Ahl al-Ilm, that they have said that the muddah هي التي ينشف بها العضو، فإذا نشف العضو السابق يلزمه إعادة الوضوء من الجديد. Some of the people of knowledge, that they have said, but rather the time period is when one limb becomes dry. So if he made wudu, he began his wudu, and then a limb became dry, that he stopped halfway, he made wudu, he stopped halfway due to a reason, something happened. And if that limb, or those limbs that he was washing prior to him stopping his wudu, that if they have become dry, then therefore he has to now start his wudu again, from new, from scratch. And if his limbs are still wet, then he can carry on and continue to make his wudu, and he does not start again. Wallahu a'lam. طيب, then he said حفظ الله تعالى ويدل للوجوب الموالاة حديث عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله تعالى عنه. And the evidence for the obligation of this concession is the hadith of Umar ibn al-Khattab رضي الله عنه أن رجلا توضأ فترك موضع ظفر على قدمه فأبصره النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال ارجع فأحسن وضوءك فرجع ثم صلى أخرجه مسلم. That a man made wudu and he left the size of a fingernail upon his qadam, upon his foot. And the Prophet ﷺ, that he saw this, and he said to him, go back and perfect your wudu. Go back and complete and perfect your wudu. And then he returned and he prayed. And this is collected by Imam Muslim. طيب, وحديث رجل من أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, and likewise the hadith of a man from the companions of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم رأى رجلا يصلي وفي ظهر قدمه لمعة قدر الدرهم لم يصبها الماء فأمره النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن يعيد الوضوء والصلاة. طيب, that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, that he saw a man praying, and on the back of his foot was the size of a dirham where water had not reached. So the Prophet ﷺ ordered him to repeat his wudu and his salah. أخرجه أبو داود وانظر إرواء الغليل. طيب, ووجه الاستدلال من هذين الحديثين على وجوب الموالاة, and the way in which these two previous hadith, that they are an evidence for the obligation of al-muwalat. And it's an important point here. How are these two hadith an evidence and a proof for the obligation of muwalat? أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يأمر من أبصر على قدمه شيئا لم يصبه الماء بغسل ذلك الذي لم يصبه الماء بل أمره بإعادة الوضوء. That the Prophet ﷺ, that he did not order the one who he saw had missed out a small portion of water, had not reached an area or a small portion of his foot, that he did not order him ﷺ to go back and continue his wudu, or to just simply wash that area. For example, his foot, didn't order him to go back and to wash his foot, but rather he ordered him to repeat his entire wudu. طيب, ولو كانت الموالاة غير واجبة كفاه أن يغسل الموضع الذي لم يصبه الماء. And if it was the case that muwalat was not an obligation, then it would have been sufficient for him just to wash that place that the water had not reached. But rather, the shahid here, barakallahu fikum, is that he sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that he ordered him to repeat his entire wudu, and not to simply just wash the place or the part that he had missed out on. طيب, and lastly, we will mention bi'idhnillahi ta'ala that this shart here, this shart of muwalat, that it is not only this obligation. This obligation of muwalat, there is not only an obligation for the wudu. It's not only an obligation for the wudu, but likewise we find it an obligation in other acts of ibadah, in other acts of worship, such as the adhan, the alfadh al-adhan, the wording of the adhan. That a person cannot cut off the adhan midway and then leave a long period of time and then return back to it and continue, but rather he starts again. And likewise, another example is the affair of al-tawaf bil-bayt, of making tawaf around the Kaaba, that a person cannot cut it off for a long period of time. He can cut it off for a short period. And if there's a need to do so, for example, he has to now go and make wudu and then come back, la bats. But as for if he was to make tawaf and then midway through he went away, came back some hours later and then continued and picked up from where he left off, then this is not allowed, but rather he would start again from new. طيب. And we will conclude with that بإذن الله تعالى. And we apologize for elongating this lesson and prolonging this lesson. And we ask Allah Azza wa Jal and يعفو عنا, that He forgives us and He pardons us. And we will conclude with that بإذن الله تعالى. ونكتفي بهذا وصلى اللهم وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. And we will briefly respond to one or two of the questions بإذن ta'ala, as we have already taken much of your time and we don't wish to delay you or prolong any longer. But we'll mention just some short and brief responses to some of them. And the first one is in relation to a person who came back from Jum'ah with wudu, and they took off their socks and put on new ones. Then I go to the toilet. So they broke their wudu. Then I make wudu for Asr by wiping over those new ones. Is my prayer valid? So from what I understood from the question is that the person remained upon wudu. So when he took off his socks and he put on the new socks, that he has not yet wiped over his socks. That he has not yet began the masjid al-khuf, that he has not yet began wiping over the sock. So he is upon his original state of wudu. And if it had been the case that he had already began to wipe over the sock, and then he removed the sock and then invalidated his wudu, then in that instance it would not be allowed for him to then put on a new pair of socks and to continue wiping over them. But from what I understood from the question is that he still has wudu and he has not yet wiped over his socks, but he has simply replaced them with a new pair, and then after replacing them with a new pair, he has then invalidated his wudu and then wiped over the new pair. And with this, بإذن ta'ala, that he still has his wudu. And there's a question here in relation to a person who puts himself out there as someone who does ruqyah, and he asks for money before doing the ruqyah, and even when he doesn't live in the same city as the person affected, that he writes something on a paper and sends it to them and tells them to put it in water and drink and it will cure them. In relation to this affair, then it has been responded to and answered many times by Ahl al-Ilm, by the people of knowledge. And generally we say that in relation to ruqyah, that what is most correct and what is ahwat is that a person doesn't ask or demand for a specific amount of money. He doesn't demand and he doesn't ask for a specific amount of money. but rather what is from the custom is that he is given something for his time and for his effort after performing the ruqyah. And wallahu ta'ala musta'an, but we find nowadays in our societies where it has become somewhat of a niche, where people have exploited the Muslim community and vulnerable members from the Muslim community who have been afflicted by these types of things, and they have exploited them and charged them amounts that are extortionate, and they perhaps haven't even cured them or haven't even done anything for them. And this is the issue. So you may find that they begin with some type of ruqyah, but perhaps they end up agitating or making the issue worse than it originally was. And they leave the person in this state, and they will not continue with their ruqyah until that person pays more. And this is sadly what we see common in the society that we live in, wallahu ta'ala musta'an. But from what we know and from what the ulama, the scholars advise with, is that a person doesn't turn and make ruqyah into a business whereby he is charging individuals and he is taking their money and charging them a specific amount, and Allah Ta'ala knows best. طيب inshallah, and we will conclude with that بإذن الله تعالى. وبارك الله فيكم for your patience, and again I apologize for prolonging the lesson and taking much of your valuable time, and we will conclude with that بإذن الله تعالى. والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.